I'm Suman. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Marco. Marco is an experiences platform that connects amazing creators and hosts with companies to help bring their people together. And as part of that, we have launched Marco Labs, which is a podcast where we interview both the creators as well as the people leaders. And super excited to be chatting with Leslie this Friday, late afternoon, evening. So
it's a perfect time for a podcast.
It is the perfect. You were making fun of me because I was in a WeWork with all these people watching me as I film this podcast.
I feel like you have an audience as you're doing this. It's great.
Yeah, there's people. Oh, yeah, I wish. Yeah, but I actually was super. I am very excited to chat with you because typically I like review people's backgrounds, and you have such a broad background that ranges from not only, I mean, in terms of function. So you've worked in strategy, you've worked in sales, you've worked in kind of leadership on the people side, and you've worked at like tons of different types of companies that have globally scaled and grown. And now you're at Bain Capital Ventures, and you're working with like a ton of different portfolio companies. So you probably have a lot of cool stuff to share about kind of your experiences. So I obviously am familiar with your background, but would love if you could just share with folks kind of your background, how you got to kind of lead the people team, be the VP of people at Bain Capital Ventures.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you set the bar a little high. So let's try to put it a little bit lower, but we'll do our best. Hopefully I have something interesting to say, but it's lovely to spend some time with you, especially on a Friday afternoon. And for you, it's basically the evening. So it's like a happy hour podcast.
Exactly.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm kind of the best way to think about it is a salesperson turned people person, just by happenstance. I was at a hyper growth company when it was a Dropbox when we were growing fast. We had a lot of work to do. I like getting my hands in different things and learning new things, and so I ended up dabbling in people work, and then here I am many years later. So I started my career at Google, ended up going to business school, joined Dropbox as a way to see a company that was a fraction of the size of Google when I joined, and see what it was like to be at a startup. And I just got the bug. I love the chaos. I love the ambiguity. I love trying to figure out how you put order to the madness. And I think most importantly, thinking through how you put together a really strong people function that scales. And not saying that every single time I've done it, it's been perfect. There's always, I feel like every time you do this, you make different mistakes, but it's a ton of learning. And I think it's probably the most critical thing you do when you're growing a company is to figure out the people you choose and the infrastructure you put in place to actually support them and help them grow. So ended up at Bain Capital Ventures about a year ago after being the chief people officer at Trip Actions. And I spend my time with our portfolio talking about all the things that we've talked about and that we'll probably be talking about today.
Yeah, totally. And so as a kind of first time founder, I could certainly not agree more that kind of convincing people to join you on what is kind of especially at the very early stages, a crazy journey is certainly one of the most challenging things, and also one of the most important things that at least I spend my time on. But I'd love to hear, obviously this is a crazy time that we're hopefully kind of emerging from, but what do you see as, you probably have a pretty good vantage point because, I think Bain Capital Ventures, 200 plus portfolio companies, like what are the biggest challenges you think that you see as a kind of a people leader right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think from like, and I'll tie this mostly to like trends and what's happening today. I think, we every single year, it feels like, or every few years, we kind of have this dialogue in talent where it's like, it's the hardest it's ever been. The war for talent is so great. I think the challenge in the last year or two for founders and for any company that's growing is not only has the war for talent gotten greater, but the game has changed. It's no longer the same game that we all were playing a few years ago, where talent was concentrated in certain areas, and hiring everything from an engineer to an operations manager in Topeka, Kansas wouldn't have been something that people would have thought about doing. But today it's very different. I think the game has totally changed. So you think about that, it makes recruiting even harder, more complex than it was a few years ago. Which is a huge challenge as a people leader. Then I think, and one of the things that I'm sure you think about all the time is because of that, you're building very different companies. If you lean into those trends and you really believe that you want to find the best talent, that talent is not necessarily all in San Francisco or New York. How do you do that? You have a very different type of culture and company you have to build, which is a whole slew of I don't want to call them problems, but like real challenges that come up when you can't do what I feel like was trendy when I started in the tech world, which was like your office is the center of your world, and like everything is about your office, and like there's so much money poured into your office, and not that
Yeah.
offices will go away. I think they'll be here in some way, shape, or form, but it's not the same as it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, and I asked that question first to then revisit kind of your past, because I'd love to then talk about that in terms of your kind of career. So, by the way, I've been to the Dropbox office, which now obviously has changed, but it is
Yeah.
kind
Mm-hmm.
of amazing.
Oh, it's
But
incredible.
yeah, I guess even before Dropbox though, right? So just even rewind so we get the full picture. So you're at Google and then you were working in a sales role, right?
Yeah.
And then you went to, so just like, I'd love to hear even before we get to your kind of like Dropbox and the rest of the kind of MuleSoft and Trip actions, kind of like what drew you to, well, first of all, why'd you get the MBA? And then how'd you, I know that you wanted to work at a Dropbox, a smaller startup, but kind of like what drew you to kind of like the strategy role and what'd you do at Dropbox?
Yeah. So I at Google, started off in a very traditional inside sales role. So like mid-market, cold call to close. I didn't even know what sales was. I was pre-med in college. So for any of you out there that resonate with that, I was gonna say I thought you were gonna be a doctor and ended up being something totally different. I'm definitely in that camp. But I ended up taking this job. My last job at Google was a huge flyer. Like it was a manager who happened to take a huge bet on me. I was the least experienced person on my team. I was the only person on the team that had an MBA. And they all hired me because I had sales experience, which they didn't have. And we were designed to be this like incubator at Google for new ad products for like the long tail. Yeah. So I got this kind of like startup within Google experience, which was really interesting, especially because we used to joke we were like the best funded startup in Silicon Valley because you're at Google. And so, which is probably, so did that. And, I just got a chance to work with everybody on my team had an MBA. I always thought I'd go to grad school. I think I spent my whole college career thinking about sciences, which I never used again afterwards, unfortunately. So I thought it would be an experience to be able to learn and grow. And my manager at the time was a really huge advocate. He had an incredible experience. So I went, and I went purely because I wanted to be able to sit in a executive room, boardroom at one point and actually know what a balance sheet was, like some of those basics around business that I just didn't ever get exposure to because I spent all of my time in college focused on the sciences. And so I went just to hopefully become a more well-rounded leader. And not that I remember if you asked me to put together a balance sheet, would I be able to do it? The answer is no. But at least
that's the last part of the interview is we're going to do a live
exactly.
modeling.
Let's cut that part. We're going to have to cut that part out. It's real embarrassing. But I just kind of wanted to be a little bit more well-rounded and have some working knowledge of the rest of the components of running a business. And it was all that. And I think and you asked about the Dropbox connection purely because I got this like startup bug at Google. I figured Google would always be there. I could go back, like why not give it a shot? And I interned there over the summer. There's 75 people back in the day.
Wow.
It was awesome. Yeah. And I loved it. It was like super smart people, really passionate about the product. And you got to really do stuff. Like that was the biggest difference. And like, I felt like I was doing things at Google, but the company was so big. I was, my impact was, not nothing, basically a drop in the bucket. But at a startup like Dropbox at the time, like you really could have impact, and that was cool. So I started as like a jack of all trades for our head of sales. It was a purely like really ambiguous role. We made up the title on the spot. It was just like, come and help me build. And so that's what I did.
Yeah. But then you transitioned to, you were working in like a strategy role, and then did you transition, like you basically got into people somehow. So then how did that kind of like lead you to that space?
Yeah, so I ended up doing a lot of work in my role in the sales team, working for the head of sales around sales hiring. So we had to go hire about 100 salespeople in a year, open up a few new offices. And my boss at the time had actually run recruiting at Salesforce in a previous life. He was a sales leader. And so he had ended up saying, hey, if you ever want to think about leading a team or, leading a function, well, I'd already led teams, but like small teams, like really small ones. This is like multiple hundreds of people. And he's like, you're gonna have to figure out hiring. So like take on the hiring project. So I ended up coordinating how we really thought about the hiring profiles, where we hired, what we were looking for, how we assessed, like, and ended up just really getting into the recruiting stuff. So I dabbled there, ended up working on our first leadership development program because we didn't have anything in place, despite the fact we were growing so fast. So just happened to get my hands. I ran the rotation program for a while, which is our new grad program. Our CFO was the one who started it. He was like, "Hey, would you be open to running it for a bit?" So I did. So I just kind of got all these, it was kind of like an L&D plus program management. So I kind of got like bits and pieces of all the different, or not all, but some of the different functions and people. And in the end, just like really found the work to be impactful. You know, I could be a salesperson. I can go, close $10 million of revenue in business, but I could also just go hire 10 people and they can close $100 million in revenue business. And like, that's the impact of that is so great. So yeah, that's kind of, I think I just got sucked in, and then it kept being decision after decision of jobs that kind of got me further and further into that world.
Yeah. And so MuleSoft, big growth story, IPO, you kind of any part of that, and then Trip Actions. Were you at Trip Actions during, like, I forget what time you left Trip Actions and headed to Bain Capital Ventures? Were you there during kind of some of the pandemic and how that affected
I was there in March of 2020. I left in September of 2020, so about 6 months after the pandemic started.
Okay, so that must have been like a super interesting experience. Just given, well, Trip Actions like responded very well, is my understanding to the.
I mean, we moved quickly, right? So we ended up we did a layoff, which was 100% the right thing to do. We had hired about almost 1,000 people in a year, and when your revenue drops to zero, and it wasn't a day, but it felt like a day. You have to make quick decisions. So huge kudos to our board and to our CEO for really making a quick decision. But it was a time when no one was doing it. It was like we were one of the first companies to do a layoff, so it was a little abrupt, and it wasn't perfect. There were a million things looking back on it that we would do differently. It was a hard time. But the truth is, it's an incredible product, and I think that's why whenever I talk to people about making decisions on joining a company, it's like it is all about the people. Work for amazing people. Work for people that you'll learn from and you'll grow. But like the product really matters, right? Like, is it something that you connect with, and is it something that is really meaningful? And like I think Trip Actions is both of those things. I love to travel. I think business travel is broken. I think that the company's obviously doing a great job weathering the storm. And I think that like if you come out of this, like the company's going to kill it, because it's like there are no other products in this space that are nearly as good. It's just it's like incredible. And I think so. What it kind of originally attracted me to Trip Actions, I think in the end it's a rough couple of years, but the team's executing. They're doing really cool things to like move the product forward in the meantime. And then I think on the other side, it'll be great. Just a really rough time. You can't predict that stuff. Like we just came out of an e-staff meeting like the week before that was like, okay, let's go hire, 1,000+ people this year, and revenue, they were just like nuts. And then, global pandemic, but who could have predicted this?
Yeah. I think the emotional toll is kind of just the whipsaw must be wild, especially people leaders, and then go do that, right? You're like,
I had to lay off half my team, many of which were from my network and people that I had managed before in my career. Like it was a heartbreaking, the hardest career experience I've had to date by far.
Yeah. I remember hearing Stuart Butterfield talk about Slack, and he was like, the scariest part was when they were like running out of money, and he was like, I convinced people to like come live in a different city and move their family, and which I'm sure kind of you did, because at this point people were coming to probably San Francisco, right? And,
and like you put your reputation on the line, you put people's lives on the line, like if you're a good leader, I think it takes so much heart to build a team. And I, not that I'm a great leader, but I think it's like, that's for me has been like I think it's probably a strength and a weakness, because it's really hard to separate that sometimes. It's like,
and the reason I asked like, what are the challenges now? And then I went to rewind to the beginning is like, I'm curious, as you were telling your stories, I was just curious to hear whether those challenges are the same. And it sounds like they're kind of different, right? Which is that the challenges you mentioned at the beginning were kind of like, hey, the game has changed. And also as part of that, perhaps this whole notion of the office, which in a lot of the places that you worked, which is kind of Google, a multiplex of, massages and
Yep.
kind of works, and then Dropbox. The cafeteria Dropbox is probably my favorite restaurant in San Francisco.
Oh my goodness. I mean, you can't, that was the problem. You never wanted to leave the office because you're like, every meal I buy outside the office is going to be worse than the meal I'm eating right now.
Totally, exactly. And so then now you think about where we are now, and how are so now you're at Dropbox, right? So we are, sorry, at BCB, fast forward, and you're, overseeing, my understanding is you work a lot with kind of the portfolio companies. There's some internal stuff, but a lot of that.
Yep.
So you probably see a lot of leaders, and what are they doing? Like, what is their plan? For some of the challenges, which is like, hey, so we obviously, as Marco, we're in the places being de-emphasized. We're going to have office space, but also people are distributed. I'm super curious to hear how your kind of portfolio companies are thinking about this.
Yeah. So on the office topic, I think the most common approach across the portfolio seems to be this concept of creating hubs where they have a sizable amount of talent within commuting distance, and using those hubs for collaboration space, like not necessarily like rows and rows of desks, but hey, maybe you want to come in a couple times a week, and this is a space that you use, and you kind of use it as a gathering point. So the hub and spoke model tends to be the most common, but a lot of those companies still have distributed talent. So then it comes into like, how do you connect those people? And that's actually where I think, and it actually ties to trip actions too. Like, I think that's where I think people will be back traveling. People are already starting to travel, and people are, excited for the after. I just think travel will look probably different. Like, I don't think you'll see as much like, hey, I'm getting on a plane for an hour meeting that we've learned today that you can do on Zoom. But I think you'll have a lot more of the, hey, our team is meeting quarterly because we're not all in the same place anymore. Quarterly, we come together and we do a big offsite, and we work on our strategy, and we stay connected, and we build our relationships, and then we go back to our homes. And whether we're in Topeka, Kansas, or we're in LA or San Francisco or New York or whatever it is, like, we have that level of connectivity. So I think that seems to be the main trend from an office perspective, is like trying to figure out how you plan for that hub and spoke model, and then how you think about, and I'm sure you're thinking about this all the time too, but it's like, how do you think about what the cadence is and what the set of processes you put in place are to ensure that people can still stay connected despite the fact they're not, all in the same room or building anymore.
Yeah, I mean, we were just in Napa for our quarterly team retreat, which we do, and we were trying to link up, but then you were in Hawaii, which is the benefit of remote work. Because, by the way, I was in Hawaii a few weeks before then with a colleague working, right? And so
it was great.
I feel like the concept of a vacation has changed, because now, instead of going somewhere for a weekend, like if I go see my sister who just had a kid, like I would stay there for 2 weeks. I'm not gonna
totally
leave, right?
Yeah, I think the danger is, though, and I don't know about you, I found myself trying to do both really well, and I think you just kind of have to realize it's like you're either working remotely, or like if you're going to go on vacation, like take the time off. Like which at the end I finally was like, I had to go to a wedding, so like I'm taking the Friday off, maybe even Thursday, I don't remember, but like because I tried to be like sort of on vacation in the afternoons, like late afternoons, once it was past specific working time, but at the mornings, and I was like, I'm not doing this very well. So I feel like you gotta lead into the remote work thing, but then also not try to do it all, and actually take some time and enjoy your time.
I'm the wrong person to talk to you about this, by the way.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, but
a colleague of Felix is like,
possible to
Hawaii,
do
but exactly right. I'm the wrong data point. But so I guess on that note, so we're talking about challenges. What about the opportunities, right? So we're emerging, like I said, hopefully, and what you're describing is flexibility, right? Which is a benefit, because regardless of how nice the Dropbox offices were, as you kind of mentioned, right? It was an enticing kind of thing to get people to spend more time co-located in one place. What are you seeing? Do you believe that there's kind of some are you optimistic about kind of the future of work and how people are going to kind of get together and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've learned a lot from being at home. I think we learned that we can do our job. Many of us can do our jobs at home. Obviously, not every job in the US can be done at home, and there's a lot of people who can't, but we're sitting here and we're on opposite coasts of the country, and we're having a conversation and getting stuff done. And that can happen, right?
Yes.
So we learned a lot about being productive at home, but I think we also learned a lot about, the other things in life that are important, that are very, or like even just like a reprioritization, right? I
Yes.
used to commute down to Palo Alto every single day, and from San Francisco,
Mhm.
which doesn't sound very far, but if you've ever been on 101 traffic, you would know that it's very far. And it's, I'm sure everyone has a version of the story, but you did things that you didn't even realize, like you did them because you, like, I don't know, it seemed
You had to do
fine,
them.
but then it's like, okay, that was 2+ hours a day. Like, what did I need to do that every day of the week? Did that make me more productive? So you start questioning those types of things. And I think what I'm optimistic about is I think that there's an opportunity for companies to really come out of this with a much more loyal employee base. Should you really lean into the good things that have come out of COVID? Like, think about it. I was talking to someone earlier today who runs talent for a tech startup, and or people for tech startup, and she was like, we had the top performer asked to move to Montana, and I was like, you know what? I will bet you that because you let the person move, like I would bet you that top performer is now way more loyal to your company than they ever would have
Oh,
been before, because they were able to do something for their life that was good for them, and they still feel like they can be successful, and that you have these mechanisms for them to stay connected. Like, that's a
yep.
level of loyalty I feel like, no offense, but like no one really had in tech. Like, the problem with tech is it feels like every 18 months someone's changing jobs, and like recruiting is hard because you actually don't know whether or not they're like good or not, because like people just like take new jobs every 18 months when there's like a new shiny object. And so I actually think that like the benefit of this, if companies handle it well, can be a new type of employee loyalty that I feel like only existed in like the past generations and has not existed for the current working ones very much.
That is really interesting. Interesting. So because okay, so of course you've heard of like the great attrition, and you have so
Mm-hmm.
many people kind of leaving. And I don't know if you read the McKinsey kind of study in
Yep.
September,
Yes.
but there's a few interesting things there. One is at least it said that tech companies experience this perhaps even more acutely, which is
Mm-hmm.
that, to your point, people in tech tend to move jobs at a fairly high rate. So perhaps some people are more loyal, but do you see the great attrition? Do you see people leaving tech jobs, like well-paying, because
Yeah.
VCV, high growth tech companies? Is that affecting your portfolio companies, or is it more so they just can't? It's difficult to win the talent.
Yeah, I don't see, I'm not having as many, like, we're having crazy amounts of attrition
Mhm.
conversations. Not that it doesn't exist. I just don't think it's maybe as widespread as it may feel. Because I also think that, think about those articles, they're really across all tech companies. It's across like all industries. It's not just tech.
Mhm.
So that might be part of the difference. I think talent is moving faster. So like attrition doesn't tend to be like everyone's just leaving because they decided they want to go sit on a beach somewhere and not work anymore. It's
Yeah.
just there's so much more competition because there's so many more great jobs. Um, but I think it's almost like we're kind of already used to that in this world, if that makes sense. It
Yeah,
was all
that's
like that's kind of existed for a while. So I don't think it's as dramatic, but at least my opinion. It doesn't feel as dramatic in tech as it may feel for other industries.
well. One thing you said resonated, and it seems kind of consistent with what the article talked about. How there is this basically all employers think that the reason employees leave their jobs is perhaps because of pay
Yeah.
or these, which are, I mean, obviously very important, but a lot of it is actually human connection and
Feeling
like
like recognized and rewarded. Yeah.
totally, which I thought was really interesting. How are you at BCV or companies that you see that are doing this well? Like, how are they actively getting ahead of? Because one of the things is we do get together because it is hard to, we now have 15 and
Hmm.
people and growing, and it is. I think what struck me was they're talking about being transactional at work versus
Yeah.
actually having relationships. And
Yeah.
I've personally noticed that if you don't know someone and it's purely transactional, like, hey, can you do this for me?
Hmm.
It isn't. You don't. The work isn't as good as if someone actually has empathy.
Yeah.
Do you see that, and B, how do you solve that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Like those personal connections make the work product and work relationships so much more effective and stronger. I think it's been the hardest thing about the last couple of years. Is like it's not even like everyone's forced to be remote, and there's some ways to build those connections that are in person. it's been really hard. I mean, it's not until the last several months that I feel like people actually started potentially dipping into an office. Like you're in a WeWork now. I'm pretty sure like a year ago that wasn't really happening. So it's like a lot has changed, which is good, and we're trending in the right direction. But I think it's hard. I just don't know if there's a replacement for those in-person connections. But I think to answer your question on like companies that are doing it well or keeping people connected, honestly, I think the companies that are doing it best are the ones that spend a lot of time and energy enabling their managers. Like they put their managers, give them a ton of support. They have a very high hiring bar and like high scrutiny in their interview process for managers. Like they don't just like let anyone walk in and manage people, because the reality is if you're connected to your manager, that person's going to be fostering connections within your team. You're going to feel more connected to the company, especially for large. I mean, you're obviously in your environment, you're doing a lot of that work, and your co-founder is too. And like, but you scale that up, it's really going to come down to whoever the line managers are. It's like not really about the executives anymore.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess one kind of different question is, you have 200 companies, and just we talk about the word culture. What is culture? How do you define culture? And does that definition like, is there a consistent definition? Do you think that companies should think about the word culture in, or?
So hard. It's not going to be an elegant definition, but I think it's kind of the intersection between your values and how those translate to behaviors. It's like what you decide, how you treat each other, and how people interact is like, I think you can put all that kind of together, and that's what what defines culture. But I think the hardest thing about culture is actually, to that point, it's like defining what it is. Like you hear a lot of buzzwords, especially in the Valley. It's like our culture is like hardworking, and it's like driven by our hyper growth, like whatever. It's just like all this stuff. Like, all the buzzwords and stuff. So I think it's like, it comes down to like, how do people actually treat each other, and like, what do you actually value as a business? And then that manifests as your culture. And I think that it's such a personal thing, and it's I'm sure you've been in interview processes too, where someone will be like, I don't think they're a culture fit. And like, that's actually, I think, can be like the beginning of the death of the culture if you start just using blanket statements like that and not actually spending the time to like unwind. What does that mean? Like you said, someone doesn't fit in the culture, but is it because, they, aren't collaborative, and we believe in collaboration here? Like, okay, cool. Like that makes sense. Right. But I think the danger of culture is like it becomes like an in-group and an out-group, right? And versus something that's inclusive. There's obviously a lot of talk about this. We think about building inclusive cultures as part of the emphasis on DE&I. But I think that like it's a great word. It's a nebulous word, but it's a tough word, because the reality is it also can be this like weird weapon that it's like, you're kind of like, oh, you're not in it, so you're out. But like, what is it? Right.
Yeah.
It's like,
and do you, when you talk, do you encourage your founders or your portfolio companies or whoever you interact with to invest and build culture, understanding that it is different for each one of them? Are those conversations that you have?
Yeah. I mean, I think the good news is these days, if you're founding a company, you've probably gotten enough input from whether it's your investors or your peers around how important people and culture are. I think it's just about how you do that, right? So a lot of my conversations when a founder will ask about how do I build culture, it starts with like me trying to understand like, what is your culture, and like, what are you trying to build? Like, what is it today? How do people operate? What do you value? What type of company you're trying to build? And then what's missing, or what are you trying to enhance as you think about evolving the company? And it's never a one size fits all thing, like people will ask like, how do you build a great culture? And maybe there's some like high level platitudes you can share that will like kind of get some of the basics off, but it's a really custom type of thought process. It's not a one size fits all type solution.
Cool. We actively we've done kind of like recently mission and vision and values sessions and all that sort of stuff. It's very fun, but it is also very difficult to define.
It's hard.
How we're trying to build our culture.
I know. I worked at a company that ended up with like 25 values. So I was like, it's not going to work.
If we're talking about values, I would challenge the founder to even remember all of them. It's like, makes it quite difficult.
Totally.
So Well, I guess like a broad question as we get towards the end here is like, what do you think over the next couple of years? How do you think they'll look like? And obviously, no one has an answer, but optimistically, like, how do you think, the future of work will evolve? And I know you mentioned kind of hubs. If you could paint a picture of like, oh, now this is how the next Trip Actions is being built, right? That like it's a hub. It's how do the most successful companies do you think look?
Yeah, I think the distributed workforce piece is a huge piece. I think it's companies will have, in a way that they didn't before, really aggressive but yet thoughtful planning around in-person experiences. Like I think because you have a distributed workforce, I mean, I remember when we were at MuleSoft, we had an annual conference that we held up until we got acquired. I think the last time it was like 1,500 people or something like that. And people thought we were crazy for doing it, but it was a hallmark of our culture and was so important. I think stuff like that won't be as surprising anymore. And it may not all be big stuff, but it may be like smaller regular gatherings. But I think it's like, even putting my mindset in Trip Actions, it's like group travel versus individual travel in terms of being a much more important component of how people interact. I think the companies that will win are going to be the ones that like not necessarily go soft and let their employees do anything, but the ones that really start to lean into flexibility and allowing people like the autonomy to do their jobs well within whatever confines they're comfortable. And I'm not sitting here saying that everybody needs to have a distributed company. I tell founders all the time, if you believe that you need to be successful, you need to have every single person in an office every day, do it. Like, do not build a company that you're not going to like, because you're just going to end up giving up and it's not going to be what you envisioned. Like, do what you need to do. So it really is up to the founder. But I think from a trend perspective, especially as you get into larger companies, I think talent's just going to keep moving. I don't think the hubs are going to go away. I don't think SF or New York is going to be like, oh, there's no talent here left anymore. I just don't think it's going to be only those places.
It's going to all move from SF to New York. No, I'm just kidding.
Exactly. Everyone's going to move to New York. Perfect.
Well, I laugh because I'm joking because my twin brother lives in SF and I now live in New York. And so we basically switched places because he was in New York really and with his wife. And then so now I still have a fond place in my heart for SF. So,
well, hopefully they'll come back to New York.
Yep. But so the last questions, what is the most interesting quickfire? What is the most interesting cultural ritual you've seen a company do, or like weirdest cultural ritual?
Weirdest. Oh man, that's a good one. I'm sure I've seen something weird. I'm trying to think back to, so I'm sure we had some weird stuff at MuleSoft. We were really into the culture there was like very, very intense. But so was Dropbox, actually, in a very different way. I think Dropbox had more overt culture, like it was like people knew what it was, maybe because it was a consumer company originally. I'm trying to think. We did some funny stuff like all hands on Friday at Dropbox. Like there were some interesting rituals there. There used to be the happy hour on Friday after all hands, and like Drew would go in. We had a music room and he would play. Like that was a pretty cool, I don't know if it qualifies as weird, but like cool or different ritual that we had. But I'm sure there's something weirder. I'll just have to think about that one. It's a good one.
Okay, fair enough. We'll get you next time. And then what is your favorite thing about being a people leader?
I think the fact that there's nothing that doesn't really touch people, right? Like you're in a business, everything touches your people. And so the fact I just love it. It keeps me like, you can't get bored. There's always something that's going on, always something that people are involved in, and the company is people. So in the end, you get a real chance to not only have impact, but again, can't ever get bored, which is great. Keeps me on my toes.
Excellent. And with that, I will let you enjoy the rest of your Friday afternoon. And this was an amazing conversation. I appreciate the time, Leslie.
It was so great to spend time with you. Have a great night.